Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you. Thanks, Kimberly. Um, Very nice to be with you and your group. Um, uh, I love the name White Flag Recovery. That's a great. It's kind of a beautiful image. Um, so I thought we might actually start, and Kimberly said it'd be okay if I led a little meditation to start with, because that way we can all
Yes,
settle in a little bit, and then I can settle in too.
love it.
So maybe we'll do about 10 minutes. I know, in AA meetings, 10 minutes is like, are you crazy? We can't meditate for 10 minutes. But in my circles, that's a short period of time. So it's all relative. So let's try about 10. And I'll just give some simple guidance uh, for people. And you can just, you can listen or just, tune me out if you want to have quiet. So starting by, you can gently close your eyes or just lower your gaze. And letting the body settle into a comfortable, upright posture. And checking in with your body, noticing how you're holding your posture. We want to find a balance between being relaxed and still being alert. So we don't want to be rigid or tense, but we also don't want to sort of fall asleep, get so relaxed that we're not really able to pay attention. So noticing if there are points of tightness or tension in the body that you might breathe into. It can be helpful too to just let the mind kind of sweep through the body. Feel all the sensations, feeling the life of the body. Check in with yourself. How are you feeling right now? Just to acknowledge that. Our feelings come and go, but they often really color our thoughts and attitudes. If we don't see them kind of lurking there, can fall into different kinds of states of agitation because we're just not really accepting, not just allowing what's present, trying to fix it or change it. So with mindfulness, we just really want to feel, allow, and hold our experience with a kind of gentle kindness. And then finally, just arriving at the breath and feeling the body breathing, its natural rhythm, not trying to control the breath, but just to feel the sensations. You can feel the breath at the nostrils, just the touch of air coming in and out. Or it might be easier for you to feel it at the belly, just the movement rising and falling. Wherever it's easy to feel and be with the breath, let that become your focal point. As we start with the whole body and then gradually move towards awareness of the breath, it's kind of like we have this layers, layers of awareness, the broader layer of the whole body, and then the more narrow layer of breath in the center of the body or in the center of the experience. Even as we try to pay attention to the breath, the mind will often continue to wander, thoughts just streaming through. So again, not struggling with that, not even trying to control that, just seeing that and gently coming back to the breath. We're not trying to suppress thoughts, but we're also not following every thought. Whenever you notice that thinking has pulled you away from the breath, just acknowledge that and gently come back. Oh, keep coming back to the breath, to the body, to the felt experience in the present moment. The patterns of thought can be quite revealing, like a kind of meditative inventory. We don't want to turn our meditation into an analysis of our thoughts, but just noticing the patterns can be very insightful. All right. Uh, I was thinking today about, yeah, I'd love to. Uh, I've been getting a lot of invitations like this, and I'm thinking, oh, I'd love to go. It'd be great. South Carolina, and meet people, and and then I thought, yeah, but then I have to fly somewhere and drag a suitcase through an airport and like stay in a hotel, and I was like, we need to get that whole Star Trek beaming thing happening. I think that's the next thing for the tech world, so that we can actually go places, but we don't have to suffer through the the bad part.
Mm.
Anyway, my name is Kevin. I'm an alcoholic and an addict. So I will kind of make this a hybrid, maybe kind of talk that I'll tell you about my background in addiction and in recovery, and then maybe a little bit about what I teach. Um, and I guess maybe I'll start a little bit with what I teach, which is kind of the culmination of that background. That they say, well, we'll not regret the past, and we'll come to see how our experience can benefit others. And so I'm a living example of that, I think. I've had a lot of experiences, not all of them great experiences, but what I do now seems to benefit others. So that's the huge gift of recovery. Um, and so, I work with people in recovery. I don't have offer a program to people like a recovery program. I got sober in AA, and I never really wanted to recreate a recovery program. But what have seen and over the years is that people often get sober through some 12 step or other program, and after a while, often years sometimes, they get kind of stuck in the process, and maybe things kind of dry up for them, metaphorically. Hopefully they've already dried up literally, but you know people kind of end wind up at a spiritual wall, and I think that's where I'm trying to help people, really help people to go deeper with their spiritual practice, with their meditation practice, and also to give them some other ways of understanding the process of recovery, because Buddhism, which is where I'm coming from with that, uh, really directly addresses the issues of addiction. That the Buddha talks about the cause of suffering being clinging, and that the way to end suffering is to stop clinging. So his path, uh, the path to spiritual awakening in Buddhism, is about letting go, which is fundamentally what recovery is about. So they seem like a beautiful pairing to me. Uh, and particularly, obviously, it's also one of the things that attracts people to Buddhism as a sort of alternative to a 12-step process, is that there isn't sort of this monotheistic God uh, that a lot of people struggle with. So let me go back and tell you a little bit of my story. Um, I was raised I was youngest of five boys, and Irish Catholic family, and a lot of drinking, and uh, um, just alcohol was just a normal part of life in my family. And my mother drank martinis, and it was always like cocktail hour, and then the dinner parties and the cocktail parties, and I came from a very, very privileged background. My father was a lawyer, and so they sort of had this aura of sophistication, right? Of like, oh yes, we're tipping back, we drink martinis, right, with an olive and all that, which is just sort of a great way of making it look pretty, you know. But there was a lot of alcoholism going on, and and I think in those days, the 50s and early 60s, as I was growing up, they there wasn't much awareness of alcoholism, although my mother was aware of it because her father was an alcoholic, um, a pretty bad one, and so my mother actually like was on like a committee of this like sort of AA adjacent organization. I can't remember what it was called, but it was like a committee that this organization that sort of supported AA. And there was like one cousin I knew who only drank Coca-Cola at parties, and he was sober. So that it was sort of like it was out there, I knew what an alcoholic was, sort of. I mean, I'd heard about him, you know. But of course, I wasn't one. So, uh, but I started drinking when I was 16, which these days is like late, right? These days, is like kids are like in middle school and they're smoking dope. But anyway, that's I got started late, but I made up for lost time. I just uh, I immediately took to alcohol, and I had a lot of emotional problems, still do actually, but anyway, in high school, I started getting depressed, and I didn't know how to handle it, and my parents sent me to shrinks, and I I s I dropped out of high school, um, which was, like, not really. I mean, it was the era, right? That's, like, starting in the mid-60s. It was like dropping out was, like, a cool thing to do, and, I had a brother 2 of my brothers dropped out of college, so it was like, "Oh, I'll show them. I'll drop out of high school, like, I'll show that I'm, like, more whatever," you know, like, somehow I'm competing to fail, you know, but one of my really clearest recollections, I got a job when after I dropped out the first time. I went back and dropped out a few times just to try to get it right, So one of my first job was mowing the lawn in the cemetery up the street from our house, and we had like push mowers. I mean, they had they were electric, but you had to push them anyway. And I remember calculating how much vodka I could buy per hour of work that I did there. And that's like that memory to me is like so emblematic of alcoholic thinking. It's like you've got a job, you're making money, and what are you thinking about? How much booze I can buy with that? So, I started drinking alcoholically right away, getting sick, blackouts. But fortunately, I discovered drugs about a year later. And so, drugs kept me from drinking too much, and then drinking kept me from drugging too much. So it was always like juggling the two. But really, by my late teens and early 20s, that was actually the most dangerous time when I was, mixing barbiturates with alcohol, and I could have easily died. There was one time I remember waking up just covered in scrapes and bruises, and I realized that somehow I had walked home from the bar that was like a half a mile away, or probably crawled home from the bar, but I didn't remember any of it. Um, and a lot of bad things can happen, when you drink to blackout. I mean, we know a lot of people die, a lot of people kill people, just bad, bad things. And so I'm very fortunate that I survived those years. But as I got into my 20s, I started to sort of control my drinking and using. And because really I just got burnt out on all the drugs and hard liquor, and I just was like, "Okay, beer and pot, nice, healthy, maintenance." And I was by then I was a professional musician, and, uh, to the extent I mean, I was making my living as a musician. It wasn't much money, but I was playing in bars, and one of the weirdly saving graces of playing in bars was that I had to be able to, get up on stage at 1 o'clock in the morning and play the last set. And so if I was going to get drunk, it was going to have to be pretty late. And most of the time I would kind of stay in some kind of balance, but uh, there was still the regular, like periodic blackouts. Um, so, but the other piece I want to talk about, because, the drugs and alcohol and everything that went with that behavior is like part of my story, but I don't there's a way in which we can kind of make that the whole story. But it's clear to me that I also had, a very positive side of me, a side of me that really wanted to be a good person, that wanted to be a spiritual person. I was always interested in spirituality and meditation. I didn't do it, but I kind of was interested in it and read about it. And and so in a lot of ways, I see it as kind of a struggle between that, like the dark and the light sides of my personality. Maybe it is plural personalities. I don't know. In any case, at a certain point in my late 20s, I actually did start to meditate. I took a course in transcendental meditation and started to do that very religiously, like 20 minutes twice a day. And then after my second meditation, I would start drinking, or sometimes I'd be high when I'd be trying to meditate. So yeah, very confused about what I thought I was doing. I clearly I was in denial about the fact that my drinking and using were a problem, uh, and that if I wanted to have a spiritual life, that I couldn't be loaded. It just doesn't really go hand in hand. Um, and I got further into meditation, and I will say, like, my story in some ways is sort of upside down. Like, you're supposed to keep drinking more and more and more until finally you hit bottom. But for me, it was almost like I was drinking less and less and less. Uh, Once I started meditating, I I wasn't taking as many drugs. I wasn't drinking as much, but I still there were still those moments, I still was an alcoholic, because even if I didn't drink for a week, I might drink tonight and get completely drunk. It wasn't like, oh, now I'm moderating it. It was just that there was like more space in between. But I started to get into Buddhist meditation and very seriously, and started to go on retreats, these silent, pretty long retreats. One of them was very long, 3 months. And, um, and And I know that, part of what was going on there was that I was trying to find a solution to uh, my suffering, just my uh, the pain that was in me since I was, 14 years old, um, which was partly depression, and um, a, a lot of it was depression, but also just sort of, that inability to know how to live. Uh, that life seemed like they didn't give me the manual, as the expression goes, like everybody else knew how to live and I didn't. So here I am, going into my mid 30s, and I still don't have a life. You know, just one failed relationship after another, one failed band after another, never really getting anywhere, and emotionally not really getting anywhere. So still struggling with the same emotions. And so a lot of that spiritual search even got derailed, where I chased out, followed with this kind of guru who was like, you know, homeless. So it's like you're it's like a cult where nobody has a home. It was not a good situation. But it was like typical alcoholic thinking, like, oh, if I meditate more, if I follow this really intense spiritual regimen, somehow that's going to fix me, and it's always looking for an answer somewhere other than the obvious place, and finally I was it was suggested to me that I look at the obvious place. And I took one last uh, stab at controlling my drinking and using, and that one failed. And so June 7th, 1985, I stopped drinking and using. And and it was like I felt like, oh, 12 steps in this AA, it's it's not really very advanced. Like, I'm much more advanced spiritually than these people, but I need to stop drinking. So I'll use them for that. But a- a- and and then very shortly, I started to see it was like going to the program and seeing how people lived made me realize how much I had missed, how completely off track my life was, you know, a- and that I needed to reassess everything, and that I had to rebuild my life from the ground up. And it was just those, as Kimberly was saying at the beginning, those kind of things that adults do, the showing up, suit up and show up, and learn how to get a job, learn how to show up for a job, uh, learn how to quit a job, like don't wait until you have another job before you quit your job, for instance. But well, I got a sponsor. It took me a while. It took me a while to really uh, realize that I needed to actually work the program. It took me almost a year before I started to really dig in and get a sponsor, and then write an inventory and make amends. And that's when everything started to really change in my life. And I went back to school, which was like bizarre to me because I hated school, right? As a teenager. I went back to school and I was like, oh, I love this, and it's, you realize, oh, like drinking and using and the life that I took on and chose threw away so much of what I really wanted to be and what I really what I loved as a younger person. And it was like rediscovering my childhood in a way, rediscovering that person who was interested in things. And somebody's like making their dinner or something
I
there.
know. I wonder if John, maybe you can mute if you are making your dinner. We're happy for you. Just mute.
So, so as I said, I went back to school and discovered oh, like I'm actually intelligent because, you drop out of high school and you kind of think you're stupid, you know? And, uh, and one of my first teachers suggested that I take up writing. And I had learned in the program to listen to people and take suggestions. So I started to study writing, and I fell in love with writing. And as a musician, it was like, oh, this is another creative pursuit, Didn't seem very practical, but I was pretty good at being impractical, and I got a job that had benefits and I, I got to go to the dentist, I mean, it's like, oh, what a concept. I kind of forgot about that. Right. Um, and, uh, and so, like, just everything just really started to change. My approach to relationships really changed, again, with the guidance of a sponsor. And so eventually, you know, I kept up my meditation during those years, but I kind of realized that, oh, that wasn't the solution. That was a piece of the solution, but I need to take care of this other stuff first. But once I got to about well, at 6 years sober, because I got sober in LA out on in Venice Beach, which nice place to get sober, by the way, if you have to get sober. Um, but, I went to community college, and so I transferred then. At 6 years sober, I transferred to UC Berkeley and moved to Northern California. And there's a lot of Buddhism up here and a lot of meditation, more than there was in LA in those days. And I had an old friend who was a teacher here, and so I started to really reconnect with that practice. And it coincided with me kind of coming to that place I was talking about before. Wasn't exactly hitting a wall, but it was like God, the Lord's Prayer, it was all okay. I didn't really I wasn't one of those people who freaked out about it, but it didn't really go deep for me. It didn't quite touch my heart, and there was something about dharma, about mindfulness, loving kindness, meditation, all these practices that really did go deep for me. So I started to ask myself then, is there some way I can blend this Buddhist practice with my 12 steps? And I've discovered some other people who were sort of interested in that. And so over those, for 5 or 6 years, uh, as I was finishing school and went to grad school, that kind of developed and my practice kind of really deepened and it started to feel really integrated. Whereas when I first started meditating before I got sober, it was like there's meditation over here and then there's everything else.
Mm.
But now it was like, oh, I'm starting to bring mindfulness into the whole of my life and I'm bringing recovery into my mindfulness. So it was all part of one thing. And then I got invited after I finished grad school. A lot of things happened all at once. Like 2 years after grad school, I got engaged, and then I was invited into a teacher training program. And a year later, I was a father, and I was a meditation teacher. I mean, the meditation training was a couple of years, but they wanted us to start teaching right away. And so, as I started to teach, it was so interesting. I mostly was like substituting for other teachers in the Berkeley and the Bay Area, teachers that I knew who were kind of mentoring me. And so I would sit in and I would give a talk and accidentally I would say something about recovery or about the steps or some phrase like one day at a time or something would come through. And then I'd be like, oh, these people don't want to hear about that. But what surprised me was that it turned out people did want to hear about it, and people started to come up to me after these talks and say, "I'd like to hear more about that because I'm in the program too." They'd be in, NA or AA or OA or Al-Anon or something. And I started to realize, wow, that I'm not really alone in this because I had felt kind of alone. I didn't feel like, you know, that I fit quite, because it's like, these Buddhists, they're so pure and good, and like us alcoholics, we're not so pure and good. We're doing our best, but we have some history, and it kind of felt like, oh, I can't really be that honest in the Buddhist world, about who I really am. But that was I realize now that was another one of those like terminal unique things, like, oh, I'm so special, I'm different from everybody else. And so I started to really think about that more and more. And eventually, because in my writing career didn't really take off. I was writing novels, and nobody bought them. Uh, so, which was sort of like, oh God, I was a musician who couldn't become, who didn't really get successful. And now I'm going to be a writer. I'm just a failure, the stories that we make up for ourselves. But eventually, so I had this idea, well, maybe I can write a book about Buddhism and the 12 steps. And I got laid off from a job. And my wife, who's an English professor, said, why didn't you call this a sabbatical? I was like, oh, I like that, a sabbatical, instead of I'm unemployed, right? And so call this a sabbatical and work on your book proposal. So I did that in 2002. Uh, and, you know, as the things that we sort of learn, one of the things I learned in recovery was that, like, the things that are a lot of times the things that are meant to happen aren't that difficult. I mean, they take a lot of work, but everything kind of flowed out of that. I wrote that proposal. I found an agent. She found a publisher. And it was like, wait, this never happened with my novels. Every time I would write a novel, I rejection, rejection, rejection. This was like, oh yeah, we want it. I was like, really? Oh, and you're going to give me money? Oh, this is great. And then of course the book came out, and it was like, oh, people actually want to read this. Because up to then, for me, it was like, "Oh, this is fun writing this book. This is great." But I didn't really think anything was gonna come of it, you know? But I started to then just get invited to teach, and wow, what an education, you know? Uh, I've learned probably as much about recovery since I published that book as I knew when I wrote it, because there was a lot I didn't understand, and, uh, and I've had to become more open-minded. Nowadays, my the place that I have, the edge of my open-mindedness is around people taking psychedelics, and, which is becoming, I guess people know, but, I try to ignore it, becoming very popular, and, um, a lot of people who are getting sober are like, I don't know, maybe they get sober because they take ayahuasca or something, and they decide, oh, I need to stop drinking, or else it's part of their spiritual journey, which, for me, psychedelics were just another way to get loaded, and so, but I, you know it's not my job to be the sobriety police, and to tell people what recovery is, or what sobriety is, or what being clean is. Um, if you're not harming anybody, and you know, you're growing, I'm gonna try to support you in whatever way I can. I'm actually getting to be a mentor now for teachers, which is another huge gift. Uh, these things happen to us in our lives in recovery, where we kind of look back and think, "Wow, people actually want to listen to me. People actually want to learn something from me. Like, wow, who am I now?" Um, but I will say, just on a side note, in terms of psychedelics, that one of the people that I'm mentoring in teacher training had a really bad experience with, like, it's called Bufo, which again, like, what? It's uh, for those who don't know, it's like the poison that comes from a certain kind of toad, and people take it like, oh, okay, and have experiences. And he had a really bad experience, and I've been helping him to recover from that. So I personally don't feel any need to have any special insights. I feel like I've got enough insights for my life. I don't need to take more drugs to get more insights. Anyway, that's really neither here nor there. And it's not exactly where I want to end, but it's sort of where I am. Uh, I will say, I do have to say, because it's kind of uh, in my life, a special moment. My daughter is going to turn 23 tomorrow. Of course, she's never seen me drink, and she does drink, but she doesn't drink alcoholically, which I can't understand. I don't know where we went wrong, but she's never seen my wife or me drink, so maybe that's. But she graduated from UC Berkeley last spring, and she worked on the presidential campaign, and she's now in Washington. And yesterday, she was offered a job, her first big professional job with a big think tank in Washington, and it's like a huge moment in our lives and in her life, and so I'm sort of celebrating it, and it is like, it's amazing to, go through this journey and to think of where I was when I was 23 years old, how lost I was, and to see that she's not lost, that she's as she's so adult, it just freaks me out. It's amazing, in really healthy ways. I mean, she's still got, kid-like elements. So she's not like boring or anything, but she just like takes on life, went to Washington, like, I'm going to get a job. She applied for she interviewed for 9 different jobs, uh, she got, it took her 3 interviews to get this job over the course of a month. And it's the job that she wanted, is a dream job for her. And so, it, the real beauty of that to me is that my recovery is something that I've passed on to my daughter. She didn't have to go through what I went through. She's able to kind of start her life where I started mine when I was 35, or, maybe even older. And so the potential is so rich and beautiful. So, so obviously, I'm sure you could hear me kind of choking up on that,
Mhm.
but that seems like a good spot to end. And I would be happy to hear from people, and if people have questions, of course, I'm happy to answer questions. But thank you all for listening.
Beautiful. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Kimberly.
Yes, we can put our hands together for you. Back to you. Thank you. So wonderful. Um, I love everything that you shared, and we'll open it up for questions. So be thinking of your questions if you have any. And I'll be looking. I think I've got the giveaways. So if you came to the meeting late, we're doing a couple of the book giveaways. I want to say so. We're going to put your sobriety date if you have a recovery date or a milestone in the chat, and we're going to give away a couple of these amazing daily reflections, right? So they're sort of a conjuring, right? It's a melting pot of a lot of your different books. And so there's a
Yeah,
lot of,
yeah,
yeah. I've been really enjoying it since I got it. And I love what you said about your daughter, right? I'm a mom too. I've got 2 children, and we know now so much more about lineages and how that our sobriety and our recovery. And I mean, I feel the healing, the suffering maybe that the generations before us go through, and
yeah,
and then my getting sober, and my looking at my demons and deconstructing them and doing the work that I'm doing in this lifetime, however hard it is, whatever I've had to go through, if it impacts that next generation, and then so on and so forth, then amazing. And
yeah.
yeah, I see that too.
Hmm. Somebody had their hand up,
Yeah.
and
I'm
then
going to end the recording
Okay, perfect.
Yeah,
before
good.
you open up.